You don't know what you're doing anymore, Mother." His voice was sharp, a whip crack in the humid Georgia air, and the pieces of my will fluttered down like bitter snow. The silence on the veranda was broken only by my daughter's cruel, satisfied smirk. They thought they had silenced me, that the house was theirs for the taking. They had no idea about the promise I made to my husband 20 years ago, or what was waiting inside that old iron safe. Stick with me to the end of the story. Subscribe if you feel a connection, and please, leave a like. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your work, or the quiet of your own living room. It helps to know I'm not alone. My name is Beatrice Monroe, and for 76 years, I have called Savannah, Georgia, my home. The morning of my birthday began like any other. The bells from the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist chimed at 7. A gentle call across the historic district. I pushed myself out of bed, my joints complaining in a familiar chorus, and made my way to the kitchen. The heart pine floors creaked under my feet, each sound a conversation with the ghosts of this house. My husband, Arthur, has been gone for 2 decades, but his presence lingers in the scent of cedar from his old study and the weight of the silence in these high-ceilinged rooms. I brewed my coffee, dark and strong, just the way he liked it. Outside, the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks swayed in the morning breeze, filtering the golden light. Most people see me as a fragile old woman, a master quilter whose only strength is in her hands. My fingers, though wrinkled and spotted with age, can still guide a needle with a surgeon's precision. I stitch stories into fabric, tales from the Gullah Geechee corridor, folklore whispered down through generations. My quilts are my legacy, or so I thought. But my children, Kevin and Brenda, they see a different kind of legacy. They see square footage and property value. The phone rang just as I was settling into my quilting frame, the vibrant threads of a new story laid out before me. It was Kevin. He didn't start with, "Happy birthday." He started with, "Mother, did you get the new property tax assessment?" His voice was tight, anxious, the sound of a man who measures life in dollar signs. I told him I had, that it was sitting on the desk in the study. The silence on his end was heavy with calculation. He saw this house not as a home filled with memories, but as an asset, a problem to be managed until it could be liquidated. "It's just, that's a lot of money for upkeep, Mom. We're worried about you," he said, the concern in his voice as thin as a single thread. I knew what he meant. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about his inheritance shrinking. He and Brenda had been singing the same song for years. A smaller place would be more manageable, they'd say. Think of the freedom you'd have. They spoke of my freedom while trying to cage me in a 2-bedroom condo and sell off my life's anchor. That phone call was the first crack in the day's fragile peace. It was a warning. I spent the next hour with my needle, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of the stitches. I was working on a quilt depicting Br'er Rabbit, the clever trickster who always outsmarted the bigger, stronger animals. It was a story my grandmother used to tell me, a tale of how wit and wisdom could overcome brute force and greed. The irony was not lost on me. My children saw me as old and frail, someone to be managed and, eventually, moved aside. They underestimated the steel in my spine, the resilience forged by a life of hardship they couldn't possibly comprehend. The doorbell rang precisely at noon. It was Brenda, my daughter from Charlotte, arriving for the birthday luncheon I was hosting. She swept in on a cloud of expensive perfume that always seemed to clash with the house's natural scent of old wood and cotton. She kissed the air beside my cheek and handed me a gift bag from a designer boutique. "Happy birthday, Mother," she said, her eyes already scanning the foyer, assessing the antique furniture, the silver that needed polishing. Her compliments were always double-edged swords. "This house has such wonderful bones," she murmured, running a perfectly manicured finger over the mahogany sideboard. It would be a showpiece with a proper renovation. The market in the historic district is just on fire right now. She didn't see the sideboard where her father carved his initials as a boy. She saw a period piece that could be leveraged for a higher sale price. I simply nodded and took the gift bag to the parlor. the bright artificial colors of the tissue paper looking garish against the worn velvet of the armchair. I knew this luncheon was a bad idea, but I'd hoped, foolishly, that for one day they could set aside their ambitions. I'd hoped they would see me, not just the matriarch guarding their future wealth. But as soon as Kevin arrived with his family, the atmosphere grew thick with unspoken agendas. He and Brenda exchanged a look, a silent confirmation of their shared purpose. I felt less like the guest of honor and more like a stubborn obstacle in their path. The day was no longer about celebrating my life, but about them planning for my absence. I still hadn't realized that their impatience had finally boiled over into something far uglier. My grandchildren, bless their hearts, were caught in the middle. Kevin's son, a quiet boy named Leo, handed me a drawing he'd made of the house, its lines crooked but full of love. He was the only one who seemed to understand that these walls held stories, not just equity. Brenda's daughter, Tiffany, was more like her mother, her eyes glued to her phone, occasionally looking up to offer a detached smile. They were products of their parents, one taught to value feeling, the other taught to value things. As I served iced tea on the veranda, the conversation was a carefully choreographed dance around the one subject that consumed them. They talked about their jobs, their vacations, their friends, real estate windfalls. Every topic was a subtle road leading back to the same destination: money, assets, and the burden of maintaining a large, historic property. I listened, my hands steady as I poured the tea. But inside, a quiet storm was gathering. They were circling like vultures, and I was tired of pretending I couldn't see their shadows. I had made a decision that morning, right after Kevin's phone call. I had spent the last week with my lawyer, drafting a new will. It was tucked into a simple manila envelope, resting on the side table in the parlor. My previous will had split everything evenly between them, the house included. But their relentless pressure, their cold-hearted focus on the material, had worn away my sense of fairness. They didn't deserve this place, not when they couldn't see its soul. They didn't deserve the history held within these walls. My plan was to announce it calmly, after we'd cut the cake. I wasn't doing it out of spite, but out of a need to protect the one thing Arthur and I built together. This house wasn't just a building. It was a living museum of our lives, of our family's history. Every quilt I made was stitched with threads of that history, and I wanted the house to go to someone who would honor it, not gut it for a quick profit. I thought, perhaps naively, that hearing my final wishes spoken aloud would make them understand. But the tension was escalating faster than I had anticipated. Brenda, accidentally, spilled a bit of tea on an antique Persian rug and sighed dramatically. "See, Mother? These things are just so hard to maintain. You shouldn't have to worry about this." It was a calculated move. Another little jab designed to make me feel incompetent, to make her argument for her. Kevin nodded in solemn agreement, his expression a mask of false sympathy that made my stomach turn. I saw them then, not as my children, but as strangers wearing their faces. The little boy who used to hide in the linen closet during thunderstorms, and the little girl who cried when her favorite doll lost an eye were gone. In their place were two grasping, middle-aged adults whose hearts had been hardened by greed. A profound sadness washed over me, a grief deeper than the one I felt when I buried their father. This was a different kind of death, the death of the family I thought I had. I excused myself and went to the parlor, my hand trembling slightly as I picked up the manila envelope. The paper felt heavy, not just with legal documents, but with the weight of my decision. Looking out the window, I saw them on the veranda, their heads bent together, whispering. They looked up as I approached, their conversation stopping abruptly. Their faces were expectant, hungry. They knew something was about to happen. It was in that moment I understood they weren't just hoping for this confrontation. They were provoking it. That look they shared, a cold, unified front, was what solidified my resolve. The quiet quilter in me receded, and the guardian of Arthur's legacy stepped forward. He had been a shrewd man, a lawyer who understood the darker parts of human nature better than I ever could. He had prepared for this. He had told me a month before he passed. His voice weak but his eyes clear. People change when they smell money, especially family. He made me promise something, a promise I had kept locked away for 20 years. He pointed to the old iron safe in his study, a hulking black box that had sat silent and untouched since his death. The real will, the one that matters, is in there, he'd said. Don't open it unless you see a betrayal so profound that you have no other choice. When you see their true faces, you'll know. For 2 decades, I had hoped I would never have to see those faces. I had clung to the belief that the children I raised were still in there somewhere. But standing on that veranda, with the scent of magnolias in the air and the sound of my own heart beating in my ears, I saw them. I saw their true faces, stripped of all pretense, the casual cruelty in Brenda's eyes, the impatient greed tightening Kevin's jaw. They were no longer my children in that moment. They were adversaries. The time for hoping was over. The time for honoring my husband's final, painful piece of wisdom had come. I walked back out onto the veranda, holding the envelope. The humid air felt suddenly cold, charged with electricity. All the superficial chatter died down. Even the grandchildren seemed to sense the shift, looking from me to their parents with wide, uncertain eyes. I cleared my throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "There's something I need to tell you all," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "Since it's my birthday, I thought it was the right time to share my most recent wishes." I held up the envelope. "I've had a new will drafted," I said, my gaze fixed on Kevin and Brenda. I wanted to see their reaction, to give them one last chance to show a flicker of something other than avarice. I saw nothing. Kevin's eyes narrowed, focusing on the envelope as if it were an enemy combatant. Brenda's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. They weren't listening to my words. They were calculating the threat level. Before I could say another word, Kevin stood up. His chair scraped violently against the stone patio, a sound that made everyone flinch. His face was flushed with a sudden, shocking rage. He was a real estate developer, a man used to hostile negotiations and bulldozing obstacles. In his eyes, I was just one more obstacle. He took a step toward me, his hand outstretched, not in a gesture of peace, but of demand. The world seemed to slow down. I could see the pulse beating in his neck, the way his knuckles were white as he clenched his fists. The sweet tea in my glass trembled, mirroring the tremor in my own hands. I saw my son, but I also saw a stranger consumed by a desperate, ugly hunger. He didn't see his mother. He saw a senile old woman making a foolish decision that was about to cost him a fortune. He didn't say a word. He just lunged forward. He snatched the envelope from my hand with a swift, violent motion that tore the paper slightly. The gasp that went around the table was sharp, a collective intake of breath at the sheer aggression of the act. I was too stunned to move, to speak. I could only watch as he held up the will, my final wishes, my last attempt at preserving our family's soul. He looked at me, his eyes blazing with a mix of fury and contempt. And then he said the words that would echo in my mind for the rest of my days, the words that finally, irrevocably, broke the spell of motherhood. "You don't know what you're doing anymore, Mother," he yelled, his voice raw and loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "This house is our birthright." He didn't wait for a response. He simply began to tear the envelope, and the documents inside, into dozens of little pieces. The pieces of paper fluttered down, landing on the table, in the iced tea glasses, on the lemon cake my granddaughter had helped me bake that morning. They fell like dirty snow, a confetti of disrespect. Brenda didn't try to stop him. She just sat there, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. In front of my grandchildren, my nieces and nephews, my children had publicly declared me incompetent, senile, and irrelevant. They had humiliated me on my own birthday, in my own home. They felt they had won, but as I looked at the shredded paper on the table, I wasn't thinking about the will he had just destroyed. I was thinking about the one he didn't know existed, locked away in a dusty iron safe. The silence on the veranda was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the chirping of the cicadas and the distant city sounds. The torn pieces of my will lay scattered like fallen leaves after a storm, a testament to the hurricane that had just ripped through my family. I looked from the confetti of my life's plans to the faces of my children. Kevin's chest was still heaving with the effort of his rage, while Brenda's cruel smirk had settled into a look of cold, satisfied victory. They believed they had won. They thought they had finally broken me. I saw my grandson, Leo, trying to hide his face in his napkin, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Across the table, my granddaughter Tiffany stared at her mother, and for the briefest of moments, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite name in her eyes. Was it shame? Confusion? It was a tiny crack in their united front, but it was enough. The other family members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their gazes darting from me to the shredded paper, none of them brave enough to speak. A strange thing happened then. The searing pain I expected to feel never came. Instead, a profound, almost unnatural calm settled deep in my bones. It was the quiet that follows a lightning strike, when the air is clean and charged, and the world is momentarily stunned into silence. I finally saw them not as the children I had raised, but as the people they had become. The realization didn't bring anger. It brought clarity, a cold, sharp, and absolute clarity. Brenda was the first to break the silence, her voice a syrupy balm intended to soothe the others. "Mother, really, it's for the best," she said, reaching out to pat my hand as if I were a hysterical child. "You've been under so much stress. We'll take care of everything now." She began to meticulously gather the pieces of paper, her movements efficient and dismissive, as if she were simply clearing the table after a messy meal. Kevin, emboldened by her support, puffed out his chest and addressed the rest of the family. "This was a necessary intervention," he announced, his voice still ragged with emotion. "She's not in her right mind. We're doing this to protect her, to protect this family's legacy." He used the word legacy as if it were a weapon, a shield for his greed. He looked around for nods of agreement, for validation of his brutal act. But I wasn't listening to him anymore. I was listening to a voice from 20 years ago, my husband Arthur's voice, raspy and weak from his sickbed. "When you see their true faces, you'll know, B. Don't hesitate. You'll know." I pushed my chair back, the scraping sound against the stone floor making everyone flinch. I stood up, my old bones protesting, but I felt taller than I had in years. My spine, the one they thought was so frail, was a rod of steel. Without a word, I turned and walked toward the French doors that led back into the house. Each step was deliberate, measured. I could feel their eyes on my back, a mixture of shock and confusion. They had expected me to crumble, to weep, to retreat to my bedroom and concede defeat. They never expected me to simply walk away from the battlefield they had created. They never expected me to walk towards a different kind of fight. "Mother, where are you going?" Brenda called out, a new, sharp edge of panic in her voice. My silence was unnerving them. My refusal to play the part of the victim was throwing their script into chaos. "We need to discuss this. You can't just walk away." But I could. And I was walking toward the one room in the house they had always avoided, the one place that was more Arthur's than mine, his study. The heavy oak door swung open with a familiar groan, and I stepped inside. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of old leather, aging paper, and the faint, lingering aroma of my husband's pipe tobacco. It was a time capsule, a sanctuary, and in the corner, like a sleeping giant, sat the old iron safe. It had been a silent, imposing piece of furniture for 2 decades, a repository of a promise I had hoped I would never have to keep. I ran my hand over its cold, black surface. For a fleeting moment, a wave of gut-wrenching grief washed over me. Opening this safe felt like a final betrayal of hope. It was an admission that the family Arthur and I had built was broken, perhaps irrevocably. Was this what he wanted? For me to declare war on our own children? The thought made my hand tremble, and for a second, I almost turned back. I almost surrendered to the sorrow. Then I heard Kevin's voice from the doorway, dripping with suspicion. "What are you doing in here? What is this nonsense?" The sheer, unrepentant arrogance in his tone was like a splash of cold water. It wasn't a war I was starting. It was a truth I was unearthing. Arthur hadn't been planning a battle. He had been providing a shield. He had been protecting the soul of our family from the very people who sought to auction it off. I turned to face them. Kevin and Brenda stood silhouetted in the doorway, their expressions hardening as they realized I was not behaving as they'd predicted. I held their gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting them see the quilter they knew disappear, replaced by someone they didn't recognize at all. Then, I turned back to the safe. My fingers, steady now, moved to the combination dial. Click. 10. Click. 28. Click. 47. My birthday. The numbers spun into place. A sequence Arthur had set decades ago. The day our real life began, he had called it. A heavy, metallic thunk echoed through the study as the tumblers aligned and the bolt disengaged. The sound was a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. It was the sound of a promise finally being fulfilled. With a deep breath, I pulled on the heavy handle. The iron door groaned open on hinges stiff from disuse, releasing a puff of stale, dry air. Kevin craned his neck, expecting to see stacks of cash or glittering jewels. His eyes widened, then narrowed in confusion. The safe was nearly empty. There was no treasure, no hidden fortune. There was only a thick, leather-bound folio and a small, velvet-wrapped box. "What is that?" Kevin sneered, his bravado returning. "Another will for us to shred. Mother, this is getting pathetic." He still believed he was in control. He still saw this as a game he had already won. He had no idea that the document he had destroyed on the veranda was a decoy, a simple test he and his sister had failed spectacularly. I lifted the folio from the safe. The leather was cool and smooth beneath my fingers, embossed with the simple initials, A.M. This was no lawyer's document. This was Arthur's final word, written in his own hand. I placed it on his great mahogany desk and opened it. The pages were filled with his familiar, elegant script. It wasn't a will. It was a declaration of independence. I didn't have to read it. I knew what it said. I simply turned the folio around for my children to see. The first page was the original deed to the house, filed with the county 25 years ago, but attached to it was a rider, an irrevocable trust agreement. Arthur, ever the brilliant attorney, had placed the house in a trust with a single, unbreakable stipulation. The property could never be sold, not as long as I, Beatrice Monroe, was alive. And upon my death, it would pass not to his children, but to the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission, with one condition, that it be maintained as a museum for traditional quilting and storytelling, forever preserving the craft I had dedicated my life to. My quilting wasn't a hobby. He had made it the legal cornerstone of our legacy. I watched their faces as the words sank in. Brenda's jaw went slack, her carefully constructed mask of superiority crumbling into disbelief. Kevin's face turned a mottled shade of red, his eyes scanning the document again and again, searching for a loophole that he knew a man like his father would never have left. The house wasn't an asset, it was a monument, and it was never, ever going to be theirs. But that wasn't all. I turned the page. The next section detailed the true nature of their inheritance. Arthur had established a charitable foundation, funded by a portfolio of commercial real estate he had quietly acquired over the years. This foundation was designed to support local artists and preservation efforts. Kevin and Brenda were named as beneficiaries, entitled to a generous annual stipend. There was, however, another clause, a morality clause. The disbursements were left to the sole discretion of the foundation's lifelong director, who was tasked with ensuring the beneficiaries acted in a manner that honored the family's values of community, integrity, and respect for one's elders. The director, of course, was me. In one arrogant, cruel afternoon, they hadn't just lost a house. They had forfeited their entire future. Finally, I picked up the small velvet box. My voice was quiet, devoid of malice, heavy only with a profound sadness. "He did leave you both something directly," I said, opening the lid. Inside, nestled on the faded velvet, were two old-fashioned, slightly rusted skeleton keys. I held them out. They're for the 2 small apartments above the old carriage house. He said you might need a place to land one day, if you ever truly lost your way. The final, devastating truth landed. Arthur hadn't just outmaneuvered them. He had seen them. He had known the potential for this moral decay, and had planned for it with a lawyer's precision and a husband's broken heart. The keys weren't a gift. They were a judgment. I closed the folio and held it to my chest. The weight of it felt solid, real. It was the weight of my husband's love and foresight. I looked at my 2 children, who stood frozen in the doorway, their faces pale with the shock of their utter and complete defeat. They were finally silent. The power in the room had shifted, not with a shout, but with the quiet turning of a page. My life was no longer a story they could edit or tear apart. I was the one holding the pen now. The silence that fell after they left was heavier than any I had ever known in this house. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude. It was the hollow echo of a demolition. I walked through the rooms, from the veranda littered with the ghosts of my birthday party to the study where the open safe stood like a silent witness. The scent of Brenda's expensive perfume still hung in the air, a cloying, artificial fragrance at war with the honest smell of old wood and leather. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollowed out, as if I had won a war by burning down my own country. That first night, I sat in Arthur's armchair, the leather folio in my lap, and I wept. Not for the house, but for the son who used to bring me dandelions and the daughter who once believed I was the strongest woman in the world. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that felt fundamentally altered. My first step was clumsy, uncertain. I picked up the phone, my hand trembling, and dialed the number for Arthur's old law partner, a man I hadn't spoken to in years. My voice was a stranger's in my own ears as I explained the situation, the words feeling like sharp stones in my mouth. He wasn't surprised. "Arthur always said you had a steel spine, B," he said gently. "He just hoped you'd never have to prove it this way." His calm validation was the first thread I could grasp in the unraveling mess of my life. It was a small thing, but it was a start. My first real stumble came a few days later. I found a small, framed photograph behind a stack of books, Kevin and Brenda, ages 5 and 7, grinning gap-toothed smiles on a picnic blanket. The innocence in their eyes was a physical blow. A wave of guilt so powerful it made me dizzy washed over me. Had I been too harsh? Was there another way? The thought that I had authored the final, irreparable break in our family was a crushing weight. I almost called them. I almost offered a truce, an olive branch, anything to get those children in the photograph back. But then I remembered the cold smirk on Brenda's face. And I put the frame down, face first, in a drawer. Learning to manage the foundation was like learning a new language in my old age. The lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, sent over boxes of documents, financial statements, investment portfolios, grant proposals Arthur had bookmarked. I would sit at the great mahogany desk for hours, a dictionary on one side and a magnifying glass on the other, trying to make sense of a world of trusts and equities. I felt foolish, out of my depth. Kevin's words, "You don't know what you're doing," played on a cruel loop in my mind. But with each page I turned, a quiet determination began to replace the fear. Arthur had trusted me with this. I would not fail him. I started a new quilt. For decades, I had stitched the stories of others, Brer Rabbit, the Flying African, the legends whispered down through generations. This one was different. I chose a simple large stark pattern, a lone, ancient oak tree, its roots digging deep into the soil, its branches reaching for the sky. The background was a chaotic patchwork of dark, angry colors, representing the storm, but the tree itself, I stitched with threads of silver and gold. It was my story, the story of standing firm when the winds tried to tear you down. The needle became my weapon and my solace. A new routine began to form, one not dictated by the dread of a phone call or the anxiety of an impending visit. I woke with the cathedral bells, but instead of just brewing coffee, I took a walk through the quiet morning streets of Savannah, nodding at neighbors. I started visiting the local arts council, speaking to young painters and sculptors. listening to their dreams. I was no longer just Beatrice Monroe, the widow. I was becoming Beatrice Monroe, the director of the Monroe Arts Foundation. The title felt strange, like a borrowed dress, but I was slowly starting to grow into it. I began to reclaim my own house. For years, I had kept it as a shrine to my life with Arthur, and more recently, as a fortress against my children's ambitions. Now, I started to see it with new eyes. I opened windows that had been sealed shut for years, letting fresh, salt-tinged air chase out the stale memories. I moved furniture, creating a new flow, a new energy. The parlor, once a formal, untouched space, became my primary quilting studio, flooded with light and vibrant with the colors of my fabrics. The house was beginning to breathe again, and so was I. The discipline came from the work itself. Every day, I dedicated 3 hours to the foundation's business and 4 hours to my quilting. The structure was a lifeline. It kept the darker thoughts at bay. It gave me purpose beyond survival. I was building something new, both on the quilting frame and on paper. I was learning to say no to investment advisors who sounded too much like my son and yes to a young Gullah Geechee basket weaver who needed funding for a workshop. Each small decision was a brick in the foundation of my new self, but the internal conflicts were relentless. Loneliness was a constant, unwelcome guest, especially in the evenings when the house grew dark and the silence returned. I would hear a car door slam outside, and my heart would leap with the foolish hope that it was one of them, coming to apologize, to make things right. The memory of my family, the one I used to have, was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. I had to constantly remind myself that the family I was mourning had died long before my birthday. One night, I found myself standing in front of the telephone, Brenda's number already half dialed. I imagined her voice, probably sharp with anger, but maybe, just maybe, with a hint of regret. The urge to hear her, to connect with my own child, was a physical craving. My thumb hovered over the last digit. What was I hoping for? Forgiveness. Understanding. I knew, deep down, I would receive neither. I would only get more pain. With a shaking hand, I put the phone back in its cradle. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done. The fear of failure was my shadow. I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I had made a terrible mistake with the foundation's funds, that I would run it into the ground and ruin Arthur's legacy. I was just a quilter. What did I know about endowments and fiscal responsibility? The weight of it felt immense, a responsibility I had never asked for. I had to learn to trust not just Arthur's judgment in choosing me, but my own. I had to believe that the same wisdom that guided my hands with a needle could guide my mind with these new, complex decisions. My old thoughts, the ones ingrained by years of being a wife and mother, fought hard to return. The instinct to put my children's needs before my own was a powerful current to swim against. Every time I reviewed a grant application, a part of me would whisper, this money could be going to Kevin's business, to helping Brenda with her debts. I had to consciously, painfully, excise that way of thinking. Their well-being was no longer my primary concern. My legacy, and the community it would serve, had to come first. The external conflicts arrived, as I knew they would. The first was a letter, thick and menacing, from a high-powered Atlanta law firm. It was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. Kevin and Brenda were contesting the validity of the trust. They claimed Arthur was not of sound mind when he created it, and that I had exerted undue influence. They were trying to paint me as a manipulative crone who had stolen their father's legacy. The accusation stung, but it also hardened my resolve. Then came the phone calls. Brenda tried first, her voice thick with manufactured tears. Mother, how could you do this to us? We're your family. We're struggling, and you're planning to give our money away to strangers. When the tears didn't work, the venom came out. You're a bitter, cruel old woman. Dad would be ashamed of you. The words were designed to wound, to find the old insecurities and pry them open, but they found purchase on tougher skin now. I simply said, the decision is made, Brenda, and hung up. Kevin didn't bother with tears. His call was a barrage of threats and insults. He called me incompetent, senile, and spiteful. He threatened to drag my name through the mud, to tell everyone in Savannah how I had disowned my own children. "You'll be a pariah," he spat. "You'll die alone in that house, and no one will care." I listened to his tirade without interruption. When he finally ran out of breath, I said, "I am not the one who is alone, Kevin," and ended the call. The silence that followed was, for the first time, truly peaceful. The social pressure was more subtle, but just as challenging. A few cousins called, acting as peacemakers, urging me to reconsider, to think of the family. They didn't understand. They still saw the picture on the mantelpiece, not the ugly reality that had unfolded on my veranda. I had to politely but firmly explain that this was not a negotiation. It was the consequence of a choice my children had made, not me. Some understood, others did not. I was learning who my true family was. My grandson Leo became a secret ally. He started calling me from his friend's phone, his young voice a balm on my weary soul. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he'd whisper. "What Dad did was wrong." He told me he still had the drawing he made of the house. He asked me about my quilts. His calls were a lifeline to a future I thought I had lost, a reminder that the goodness in our family line had not been entirely extinguished. It had just skipped a generation. The first real taste of progress came when Mr. Abernathy called with news. "They're dropping the lawsuit, B," he said. "Their lawyers know they don't have a case. Arthur made that trust airtight." A wave of relief so profound it buckled. My knees washed over me. The external threat had been vanquished. Now, the only battles left were the ones within myself. It was a turning point. The fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. My first official act as director of the foundation was to approve a grant for a community arts program that taught quilting to at-risk youth. I went to the center to deliver the check myself. Seeing the faces of those young people, their hands fumbling but eager to learn the craft that had saved my life, was more rewarding than any inheritance could ever be. I wasn't just preserving a legacy, I was planting the seeds of new ones. I was helping other people tell their stories. I began hosting a small quilting circle in my parlor every Thursday afternoon. The house, once so silent and heavy, was filled with the sound of laughter, chatter, and the gentle snip of scissors. Women from all walks of life gathered, sharing stories as they stitched. They saw me not as a fragile old woman or a vengeful matriarch, but as a master of my craft, a mentor, and a friend. The house was finally becoming what it was always meant to be, a place of creation, not contention. One afternoon, Leo showed up on my doorstep, alone. He'd taken a bus from Atlanta without telling his father. He was holding a new drawing, this one of my Briar Rabbit quilt. "I wanted to see it for real," he said. We spent the afternoon together, me telling him the stories behind each quilt, him listening with wide-eyed wonder. When I drove him to the bus station that evening, he hugged me tight. "You're not what Dad says you are, Grandma," he said. "You're the strongest person I know." The day I finished my quilt of the old oak tree, I hung it in the foyer, right where Brenda used to stand and assess the home's market value. The tree stood tall and defiant, its silver and gold threads catching the afternoon light. It was a declaration. This house was rooted in something far more valuable than money: purpose. It was a testament to survival, to resilience, and to the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground against a storm, even when that storm is your own family. My confidence grew with each passing day. I learned to read a balance sheet, to chair a board meeting, to speak with authority about my vision for the foundation and the museum. I was no longer just the keeper of Arthur's flame. I was tending a fire of my own. The work gave me a reason to get up in the morning that had nothing to do with the past, and everything to do with the future. I was building, creating, and contributing in a way I never thought possible. I stopped looking at the old photographs, not because they were too painful, but because they no longer represented my reality. The woman who had raised those children in the pictures was gone. She had been a loving, accommodating, and often silent mother who had been worn down by years of quiet disappointment. The woman I was now was someone else entirely. She was the one who had opened the safe, faced down her children, and taken control of her own story. One evening, I stood on the veranda, looking out at the Spanish moss swaying in the twilight breeze. I felt Arthur's presence, not as a sad memory, but as a proud and loving partner in this new chapter. The house wasn't empty anymore. It was full of plans, of hope, of the future voices and stories that would soon fill its halls. The profound sadness had finally lifted, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of peace. I had not only protected our legacy, I had finally, truly, claimed my own. I was no longer the same woman who had poured iced tea on this very spot just a few months ago. I was Beatrice Monroe, and I knew exactly what I was doing. The first official event for the Monroe Arts Foundation was not a stuffy gala, but a community story day, held right here, in this house. I threw open the French doors to the veranda, the very same doors I had retreated through in shame months earlier. Instead of a tense family luncheon, the space was filled with the vibrant energy of children learning to weave sweetgrass baskets and elders sharing tales under the shade of the oaks. The air, once thick with greed and unspoken resentments, was now alive with laughter and music from a local Gula Geechee band. I served sweet tea in the same glasses, but this time they were filled with celebration, not sorrow. It was a baptism for these old walls, washing away the stains of that day. The youth quilting program we funded became my greatest joy. One afternoon, a quiet teenager named Sarah, who had been getting into trouble at school, showed me her first completed quilt square. It was a chaotic jumble of dark colors, but in the center was a single, bright yellow star. "This was me before," she said, pointing to the darkness. "And this is me now." She told me that the focus required for stitching, the simple act of creating something beautiful from scraps, had quieted the anger inside her. In that moment, I saw my own story reflected in hers. I wasn't just funding a program. I was providing the needle and thread for others to mend their own lives. The plans for the museum took on a life of their own. Architects and historians from Charleston and Atlanta began visiting, walking through the rooms with a hushed reverence that my own children had never shown. They didn't see peeling paint or outdated fixtures. They saw original heart pine floors, handcrafted moldings, and a living piece of Savannah's history. They would ask me about the house's stories, about the day Arthur brought me here as a bride, and they listened with genuine fascination. I was no longer the crazy old woman who didn't know what was best for her. I was the curator, the primary source, the respected guardian of a local treasure. My own work, for so long a private solace, stepped into the light. A writer from a national arts magazine came to interview me, spending an entire day watching me work, her questions thoughtful and insightful. When the article was published, it was titled, "The Weaver of Savannah," and it spoke of my quilts not as crafts, but as narrative tapestries. Galleries from as far away as New York began to call, inquiring about exhibitions. The ultimate irony was that by refusing to sell the house my children coveted, I had inadvertently built a name and a career for myself that was far more valuable and far more lasting than any real estate transaction. The foundation, which Kevin had assumed I would bungle, began to flourish. Guided by Arthur's meticulous notes and my own intuition, I made careful, community-focused investments. I discovered I had a knack for seeing the potential in people, not just in portfolios. The initial endowment grew steadily, ensuring that the foundation would not only be sustainable, but would expand its reach for generations to come. Every financial report that showed our success was a silent, definitive answer to my son's shouted accusation. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I was doing it better than he ever could have imagined. The city of Savannah began to see me differently. When I walked to the market or the post office, the casual nods from neighbors were replaced with warm smiles and words of encouragement. "What you're doing at the Monroe House is just wonderful, Beatrice," people would say. They saw the life returning to the old home, the lights on in the evenings for community meetings, the school buses dropping off children for art classes. I had inadvertently become a public figure, not for any wealth or status, but for my commitment to preserving the city's soul. I was no longer invisible. I was a part of the fabric of my own town. One of my cousins, the one who had called to urge me to make peace for the sake of the family, stopped by unannounced. She stood in the foyer, looking at the newly hung quilts on the walls, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. I had no idea," she stammered. "We all thought, we thought Kevin was right, that you were just being stubborn." She looked at me then, truly looked at me, and said, "I'm so sorry. What you've done here, it's a legacy, a real one." Her apology was a healing balm, a sign that the truth, like a strong thread, could pull even frayed relationships back together. Of course, there were still whispers. I heard through the grapevine that Brenda told her friends in Charlotte that I had lost my mind and was squandering their inheritance on charity cases. Kevin, I was told, referred to me in business dealings as his eccentric mother. In the past, those words would have cut me to the bone. Now, they felt like pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. Their opinions no longer had the power to define me. Their narrative was a ghost story, a tale of a woman who no longer existed, and I simply refused to be haunted by it. Leo remained my steadfast anchor to the future. He came to Savannah every other weekend, taking the bus himself. He wasn't a visitor. He was a volunteer. He helped organize the library in Arthur's study, scanned old family photos for the museum archives, and learned the names of every student in the quilting class. He was absorbing the history and the values of the foundation through his pores. One day, he told me, "When I grow up, I want to help you run this place, Grandma." In his eyes, I saw the true continuation of our family's legacy, one built on service, not selfishness. The most unexpected development came in the form of a letter with a Charlotte postmark. It was from my granddaughter, Tiffany. The handwriting was hesitant, the words stilted. She apologized for her silence on my birthday, for not standing up to her mother. "I see you on social media sometimes. What you're doing with the house," she wrote. "It's amazing. Mom doesn't get it, but I think I do. I hope I can be as brave as you someday." It wasn't a plea for reconciliation, but something far more valuable, a flicker of understanding, a seed of the Monroe steel taking root in a new generation. Sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection in the dark glass of the parlor window. Months ago, I saw a woman stooped by grief and disappointment, her eyes clouded with weariness. The woman who looks back at me now is different. Her spine is straighter, her gaze is clear, and the lines around her mouth are from smiling, not from frowning. I still see the 76 years in my face, but they are no longer a map of my sorrows. They are a testament to my survival. I look like one of my own quilts, pieced together from scraps, but stronger and more beautiful for the stitches. I used to live in dread of the telephone. Its ring was a summons to another battle, another demand, another thinly veiled insult from my children. Now, the sound is one of possibility. It's a young artist calling to thank the foundation for a grant that bought her first kiln. It's a historian from the university asking for my perspective on Gullah folklore. It's Leo, calling just to tell me about his day. I have reclaimed that simple device, transforming it from a conduit of anxiety into a connection to a world that is vibrant, supportive, and full of purpose. I often think back to that moment on the veranda, feeling so small and powerless as my son towered over me, tearing my life's plans into pieces. I contrast that with the feeling I had last week, standing at a podium in the city council chambers, accepting an award for historic preservation. My voice didn't tremble. I spoke clearly about the importance of protecting our shared stories, our communal homes. I was no longer a victim in my own story. I had become its narrator, speaking with an authority that came not from anger, but from a deep, unshakable sense of self. In a drawer in Arthur's desk, I found one of my old weekly planners from before the birthday. The pages were filled with timid entries: call Brenda about her trip, pick up Kevin's favorite coffee, Polish silver before family arrives. It was a chronicle of a life spent anticipating and appeasing the needs of others. My new planner sits on top of the desk. The pages are filled with bold ink. Board meeting, 10 a.m. Lecture at Arts College, 2 p.m. Review grant proposals. My life is no longer about maintenance. It is about creation. My relationship with this house has undergone the most profound transformation of all. For 20 years after Arthur died, it was a mausoleum of memories. Then, it became a fortress to defend against my children. Now, finally, it is simply my home and my partner. We are growing old together, but we are not fading. We are becoming more ourselves. The creak of the floorboards is no longer a lonely sound. It's the house settling in for another day of good work. We are both filled with life, light, and purpose. The journey here was not without its cost. I do not pretend that the decision I made was painless. There is a wound in my heart shaped exactly like my two children, and some days it aches with a phantom pain. I grieve for the little boy who loved my stories and the little girl who wore the dresses I stitched for her. But I have learned that you cannot save people from who they have chosen to become. You can only save yourself. And in saving myself, I saved the very legacy they sought to destroy. I finally understand Arthur's last, greatest gift to me. It wasn't the house or the foundation. It was the key to the safe. By locking away the truth until I was ready, he gave me the chance to find my own strength. He didn't want to fight my battles for me from the grave. He was empowering me to fight them myself. He trusted that the quiet quilter he loved had a warrior's heart. He was giving me not just a shield, but also a sword, and the permission to finally wield it. My definition of legacy has been completely rewoven. I once thought it was about bloodlines, about passing down property and possessions from one generation to the next. I now know that is a fool's definition. A true legacy is not what you leave to people, it's what you leave in people. It is the story that inspires, the skill that is shared, the community that is nurtured. My legacy will not be etched on a tombstone. It will live in the stitches of 1,000 quilts made by hands I have helped to guide. I still have the 2 small skeleton keys from the velvet box. They sit on my mantelpiece, a quiet reminder. I don't know if Kevin or Brenda will ever understand their meaning, if they will ever need a place to land after losing their way so completely. I no longer wait for their call, but I leave the keys there as a testament to the fact that even after the deepest betrayal, a mother's heart holds a small, stubborn door open, even if it knows no one may ever knock. This evening, I am sitting on my veranda, the place where my world was torn apart. The sun is setting, casting a golden glow on the oak trees. There is no anger here anymore, no residue of pain. There is only a profound sense of peace. The storm was terrible, but it was necessary. It washed away all the illusions, all the false hopes, and all the fear. It cleared the land and watered the soil, allowing something new and beautiful and true to finally grow in its place. Today was the grand opening of the Monroe House Museum of Southern Story Quilts. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the mayor spoke of heritage and community. But my proudest moment was when my grandson, Leo, stood beside me, holding one end of the velvet ribbon. He looked up at me, his eyes shining, and squeezed my hand. In that simple gesture, I felt the circle complete. The past had been honored, the present was a celebration, and the future was standing right next to me, holding on tight. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't use the prepared notes. I looked out at the faces in the crowd, my neighbors, the students from my classes, the artists we had funded, and I spoke from my heart. I told them that a life, much like a quilt, is made of many pieces, some bright and some dark. There will be times when the threads break and the pattern is lost, but the beauty is in the mending. The strength is in the stitches we use to join the broken pieces back together, creating something new and unexpectedly beautiful. My story is not just my own. I believe that inside every person who has ever been made to feel small, invisible, or incompetent, there is a quiet strength waiting. It is not loud or aggressive. It is the patient, resilient strength of a single thread that, when woven together with others, can create a tapestry strong enough to withstand any storm. Do not ever let anyone convince you that your voice is too quiet to be heard or your contribution too small to matter. The most powerful legacies often begin with a single, steady hand. I want you to remember that your worth is not a number in a bank account or a line item in a will. It is not defined by those who see you as an obstacle or an asset. Your true worth is measured by the integrity you live with, the creativity you share with the world, and the courage you find to tell your own story, in your own voice, on your own terms. Do not ever let anyone tear that up. It is the most valuable thing you will ever own. Now, as the last of the guests have departed, I sit alone in the main gallery, my old parlor. The lights are low, casting a warm glow on the quilts that line the walls, my life's work, my story. I run my hand over the intricate stitching of the great oak tree, its silver and gold threads gleaming. The house is quiet, but it is not empty. It is full of purpose, full of stories, and full of peace. My story is far from over, but for the first time in a very long time, it is entirely my own.